It's late. It's 3 in the morning. A little after 3 a.m. And as you can see, I'm in my room at home, and my folks are asleep in the other rooms across from mine. So anyways, yeah, it's the early hours of Saturday, July 24th, 2021, and this is my today's video message for my friend Lilla, or Lila as I like to call her, a friend of mine who lives in Europe. She lives around and around the world while I'm lying and lonely, and I live in Oklahoma, and you can tell by my accent that I'm an Okie. I'm filming this handheld, so forgive the jumpiness and the shakiness of the picture quality. And today's video message, Lila, if you are watching, is I have a really cool hoodie collection. As you can see, I have lots of cool hoodies. I collect a lot of different things. You can't see them, but I got a bunch of books. I got 3 bookshelves, or 2.5 bookshelves, I should say, but many other books stacked elsewhere around the room. Some of them are library books. Most of them are books I own. And then I got a bunch of other stuff scattered around the room. I got art supplies, canvas, shoes, an 8-piece queen comforter set in the corner, a water bottle, a huge industrial fan that I sleep to, a magic 8-ball, my guitar, a trash can, 2 dressers, two boxes of oversized headphones, and a stick of deodorant. That's the other stuff in this room. Not to mention a antique thing that you put things in. I guess you could call it I don't know, it's a weird little cabinet thing on legs, and it sits beside my bed. And I have a ceiling fan, which you can hear, and then I have a lamp that I read by, right next to the bed as well. Yeah, so 3 a.m. I'm still up. I won't be after making this video. And I don't know, I've just been thinking about different things that we talked about while texting each other, and I've been thinking about other stuff that we haven't been talking about. Just random things. I was thinking about jazz music for one, and comics, and I was thinking about a graphic novel I read the other day, reread the other day. It's by Neil Gaiman. It's a graphic novel he wrote a long time ago called The Books of Magic, and comprises like every magical or occult character in DC comics. All make appearances, or most of them make appearances, and it's a really good comic. I really, really like it. It's a very well written and very well illustrated story. I'm feeling surprisingly tired all of a sudden. I was wide awake till just now, and now I'm starting to feel tired. I've been thinking about other things too lately, like the novel Finnegan's Wake, which is written in a subconscious stream of consciousness, dreamlike gibberish language, and most people haven't read it. Most people have never even completed it, And it's not really a novel for casual reading, but more for academic study. But it's a very interesting novel. I've read pieces of it. I'd like to read it from cover to cover. I most likely never will, but I would like to. And speaking of novels, I just started Stephen King's The Institute. I'm just to the second part of it. Not very far in. But it's an interesting story. And it's starting off in an interesting way. And also thinking about bossa nova music, which is something we've talked about, and how I need to listen to more of that. I'm also thinking about writers that I've heard of and I'm familiar with by reputation but haven't actually read, like Carl Hyacin, Kate Atkinson, Chuck Wendig, John Irving, John Saul, Graham Masterton, David Drake, Frank Herbert, John Sanford, Donna Tartt, and who else? I'm trying to think of writers that I know of but haven't read anything by. Poppy Bright, David Badalci, Steve Martini, Nikki Spillane, Ryuichi Murakami, I think that's his name. The other Murakami, not Haruki Murakami, but the other famous Murakami. Several others. Ian Banks. Trying to think of other writers that I know of and I've read about but haven't read anything by. There's several more. But those are some that I'd like to read and become familiar with their work and see what I think about it. Chuck Palahniuk is another writer that is very popular, very notorious, very famous, or infamous, depending on your view. Very prolific, but I haven't read a single novel of his. He's written a lot of novels, but I haven't read any of them. Like everybody else, I've seen the movie version of Fight Club, but I've never read Fight Club. I've never read anything else he's written. I've never read Invisible Monsters or Damned or Haunted, Survivor, or anything else that he's published. I should read his stuff. And there's other writers I'm thinking about who I have read, but only read like one book, and I would like to read more. Some of those writers would be Ian McEwan, China Miéville, who else? Those are the two main ones that I'm most interested in reading. Mary Higgins Clark would be another. Ha Jin, who wrote a great novel called Waiting. I would definitely read more by because that was an excellent novel. Ann Tyler, Jane Smiley. Who else? Paul Tremblay. Who else? I'm sure there's others. I'm so tired I can't think. Robert McCammon for sure. Dan Simmons. Who else? And there's some I can think of, but I can't think of their names. There's a Chinese writer who wrote a great novel called Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress. And I forget his name, but he wrote some other novels. I know he wrote at least one other. And I would like to read more of his stuff because I read that book years ago and I still think about it. And there's other writers that I've read, like one book or just maybe some short stories by. I would like to read novels by. And there's some that I read a few novels by. I would like to read more of their stuff, become more acquainted with it. Larry McMurtry is one. Raymond Chandler is another. Ian McEwan, like I mentioned. Laird Barron, Brian Evanson, Peter Straub. Who else? Lisa Goldstein, C.S. Friedman, who's C.S. Friedman's novel, This Alien Shore, has been on my mind a lot. I read This Alien Shore years ago, but I still think about it all the time. And I know she's written other novels, but I've yet to read any of them. But This Alien Shore was an excellent science fiction novel. I'd like to read more. I'd also like to read more Robert Heinlein. I haven't read a whole lot of Robert Heinlein, but I like the novels I've read by him. And I would say the same for Arthur C. Clarke. Who else? I'd like to read more John Steinbeck. I've only read some novellas that he's written, like The Pearl and The Red Pony. And I'd like to read I'm trying to read more writers that are short stories that I've only read some short stories. Like, I like Alice Munro, but I've read a lot of Alice Munro, and she only writes short fiction. That's what she's known for. And there's writers I read a lot of, and I still want to read more of. I want to read more King. I read almost everything Stephen King has done, but I'd like to read the few things I haven't. I'd like to read more John Updike, who I've read a couple of things by. Definitely want to read more Joyce Carol Oates, who has so much material that it's hard, impossible really to catch up on. I've barely made a crack into reading her stuff, and I've already read quite a few things by her already, but she has so much material that it's hard to catch up on, and I'll probably be reading her the rest of my life and never catching up on it. And there's a lot of nonfiction writers I would like to read or read more of, like Joseph Ellis, who's written some great historical books. Malcolm Gladwell, Carl Sagan, Christopher Hitchens, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and other people like Susan Orlean, and the guy who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, I can't think of his name, and Oliver Sacks, and other great nonfiction writers like John McPhee. I think that's his name. And Steven Pinker, of course. Neil Postman. I have a couple of Neil Postman's books, like Teaching is a Subversive Activity, The End of Childhood. I have both of those. And I'd like to read some like historical nonfiction writers that I haven't read yet, like Ron Chernow and David McCullough. And who else? Alex Ross. Trying to think. Griot Marcus. Richard Dawkins, who I've listened to lectures by, but I haven't read any of his books. Same with Sam Smith. I like his lectures. I haven't read any of his work, although I have one of his books called The End of Faith. There's a lot of nonfiction writers I'd like to read, or reread, or read more of. I read, I can't remember the guy who wrote it. I want to say his name, something Frazier, who wrote The Golden Bough. I read that years ago, and I liked it, and I can't think of the dude's name who wrote it. Very interesting book about folklore and anthropological tradition. And of course, I'd like to read more of the graphic memoirs of Alison Bechdel, who wrote Fun Home and a bunch of other like autobiographical comics. I've been wanting to break into more nonfiction lately. I mainly read fiction, but I've kind of wanted to really start reading more nonfiction and integrate that into my typical reading as well. I'm trying to diversify my reading a little bit, because while I read novels constantly, I'd like to read other stuff too, or read other stuff more. It feels like years ago I was more eclectic in what I read, and now usually the only thing I read is poetry, short stories, and novels, especially novels. So I'd like to kind of start injecting a little other variety into that, and going back to reading other stuff more often, like reading comics more often, reading nonfiction more often, reading biographies more often, reading books on science and history more often, because there was a time when I read those just as regularly as I read fiction. I used to read nonfiction fairly avidly and would mix it in with my fiction reading to where there was more of a balance than there is these days. Although, not to say I haven't read any nonfiction. Just this year and last year, I read a few nonfiction titles interspersed within all those novels and collections of short stories. My Goodreads list will show a few nonfiction titles popping up here and there again in my reading, but I'd like to start, being a little more diverse, again, with what I'm reading. And there's still a bunch of like comics that I haven't read, by talented writers and artists that I've either heard of and just never got around to, or people I've yet to discover. I especially like to read a lot of P. Craig Russell's work, who's a very famous, renowned, and very talented illustrator who works in comics and has done a wide variety of stuff, everything from Marvel stuff to DC stuff to illustrating characters like Batman and Conan but has also done things like he's done adaptations of like opera. He did an adaptation of Mozart's The Magic Flute in comic form, and he also did the same thing with Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung, and I think he did one or two other opera adaptations, and he's also published like collections of his like sketches and stuff, his like sketchbooks as comics and stuff, I think, or something like that. Something I read about it a long time ago. He's also illustrated adaptations of Neil Gaiman's stories. He did an adaptation of Gaiman's Coraline. He did an adaptation of Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. And recently he did an adaptation of Neil's book, Norse Mythology. And those are interesting and very well illustrated takes on the books. I'm a big fan of Coraline, and I've read that novel many times. I don't usually reread books. Very rarely do I reread anything. But Coraline I've read a lot of times, and it's a story I really like, and a novel that's very near and dear to me. And I love its vibe. I love the characters, and I love this kind of dark fairy tale type story that it has. And I thought Russell's adaptation of it as a comic was very well done. Same with his adaptation of The Graveyard Book, which was a very good novel as well. And it's cool that, you know, Neil not only writes original comics, but often has his prose adapted as comics. Almost everything he's written as a novel has been adapted, or short story has been adapted as into a comic format. I think that's pretty interesting. And I would like to read those that I haven't been around to yet. And just looking at my shelves, I have a lot of nonfiction I need to get around to. I have a biography of Warren Zevon that I need to read, a biography of Lou Reed by Anthony de Curtis I need to read, a biography of Miles Davis I need to read. Let's see, I got a couple of books on the history of jazz I need to go through and read. I have a huge book on the founding of New York City I'd like to read. Several books on neuroscience I would like to read. Some books on writing that I already have read but wouldn't mind rereading. A biography of Chopin I'd like to read. A few books on the classic albums I would like to read. So my nonfiction shelf is fairly full. And there's a lot of things on there that I either have read and would mind rereading or just need to get around to. Same with the comics I have on my shelf. Most of them are ones that I've read several times. But there are some on there that I admit that I haven't read yet and would like to. Although most of the comics I have on my shelf are ones that I'm very familiar with, such as Sandman, Mr. Punch, Violent Cases, A Distant Soil, Watchmen, From Hell, Blankets, Persepolis, Bone, All Summer Long, and some other like Neil Gaiman books like The Collected Death and Signal to Noise. A bunch of Gaiman comics that I've read before. Especially one of my favorite art books I have is Neil Gaiman's desk covers that he did for The Sandman, with commentary by Neil Gaiman. I'm a big fan of Dave McKeon. He's my favorite artist, and I have a couple art books by him. And those are some of my favorite like art books. I also have some other art books, like I have a book of Hopper paintings, a book of like Picasso, a book of William Eggleston's photography, because Eggleston's my favorite photographer, and he's a big influence on me as a photographer. And I have a few volumes of the Year's Best Fantasy and Horror, famously edited by Terry Windling and Ellen Datlow. I have the first few volumes of that. I'm collecting them as I go, and then I'm planning on starting to read those through, which I have a long way to go because those annual anthologies started in the 80s, and were done for many years. So I'd like to read those and start reading the various stories in those. And on the dresser I have over here, underneath this mirror, has several books stacked up on it, most of which I haven't read. And some of those include some Harlan Coben thrillers, a couple China Miéville novels, a couple of Chuck Palahniuk novels, the Song of Ice and Fire novels, a book of short stories by Elmore Leonard, Terry Pratchett's novel Sorcery, which I love the Discworld books, and I'm going through those too. I'm slowly going through that series. I'm reading them chronologically in order of publication. So Sorcery is the 5th book that was published, and so I'm very, very just kind of breaking into the Discworld books. But they're very great. They're like comedic fantasy, and they're very satirical about real life and real things. And they satirize things like religion, war, politics, money, cultural clashes, gender discrimination, things like that. It's a very great series. It satirically holds a mirror up to our own world in the guise of comedic fantasy. I also have other novels and books on that dresser. I have Dal Mossman's The Stones of Summer, Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, East of Eden, Finnegan's Wake. What else? I got a Star Wars novel called Before the Storm. Some Ruby Jean Jensen, who wrote some like horror novels mainly about kids, killer kids. I have a couple of Ray Bradbury books. One is Fahrenheit 451, the other is The October Country. I have a novel called Save the Last Dance for Me, which is like a cheapo 80s paperback horror novel. What else? I have a book by Charles S. Grant called Something Stirs. Charles Grant was a great horror writer who wrote very like what he called quiet horror, very like almost dark fantasy. It was more about suspense and tension than it was extreme stuff. I have a book by Linwood Barclay called Broken Promises. Barclay is like one of my favorite like mystery writers right now, working today, and I've read a few of his novels. I'd definitely like to read more of his stuff. And I bought Broken Promises, or Broken Promise, singular, and I just haven't got around to it, although I would really like to, because Barclay is well worth reading, and any of his novels are excellent. The few I've read by him were all like standout novels, which is saying a lot considering I read a lot of mysteries. Like mystery fiction is one of the main things I read, and he excels at it. And he's definitely one of the best in the mystery writing game. And on the shelf across from me, I have several different things. I have several novels by Haruki Murakami. I have Catch-22. I have some collections of Raymond Carver. Several novels by Stephen King, including the Dark Tower series, a first edition of It, first edition of 4 Past Midnight, a paperback copy of It, a paperback copy of The Stand, a second paperback copy of The Stand in a completely different edition, a copy of Salem's Lot, a copy of Black House, a novel he wrote with Peter Straub, a copy of The Outsider, a copy of 11/22/63, which I've read a few times and is one of my very favorite King novels. I have a really old vintage paperback copy of The Tommyknockers, which is a great novel, and I've read it a couple times, but I mainly bought this edition purely for the great cover art. And I have a paperback copy of the Bachman books, which also has some great cover art as well. And I have a copy of Different Seasons, a copy of Skeleton Crew. Also on the same shelf, I have several novels and stories of short story collections by Joyce Carol Oates. And I have some novels by Peter Straub. And then I have a few books of plays. I have a book of plays by Joyce Carol Oates called The Perfectionist. I have a collection of plays by Clive Barker called Forms of Heaven. And I have several books of poetry. I have a book of Raymond Carver's collected poems. I have a book of Lou Reed's collected lyrics. The complete poems of E.E. Cummings, who was one of my top favorites. I have selected poems of James Dickey. I have a selected edition of Yeats. I have a Anubis collection of various writings, short stories, articles, essays, and poetry by Dorothy Parker. I have complete poems of Edna St. Vincent Millay, the complete Emily Dickinson, a book of selected poetry by Charles Bukowski, and Edward Doran's book-length poem, Gunslinger, as well as Amanda Gorman's book, This Hill We Must Climb. And then I also have a bunch of nonfiction on the bottom shelf. A bunch of them are the For Dummies books, like Starting a Business for Dummies, things like that. I have a Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. I have some other nonfiction. I have a book about David Letterman. I have a book about Akira Kurosawa. I have a biography of Raymond Carver. And what else? Some nonfiction books by Haruki Murakami. And a collection of essays and articles by Hayao Miyazaki, which two of them. Volume 1's called Starting Point, and Volume 2 is called Turning Point. And those are very wonderful books. I'm a big fan of Hayao Miyazaki, and those are very valuable collections of articles and illustrations and such by him for any fan. And then on this desk I have a tall stack of library books, most of them by Joyce Carol Oates. I have the aforementioned collections of the year's best fantasy and horror. I have several art supplies, canisters of paintbrushes, of pencils, of pens, markers, Sharpies, and I have several YA paperbacks published in the 80s and 90s for teens. I have a lot of teen thrillers from that era, most of them by R.L. Stine, some of them by Christopher Pike, some of them by other writers who wrote YA fiction thrillers at that time, such as Carolyn B. Cooney, Diane Ho, Richie Tankersley, I want to say surname, and some others. Mostly R.L. Stine, though. And, let's see. I mentioned most of what's on the shelf directly opposite me, which are comics, nonfiction books. And on the very bottom of that shelf, I have the original 62 Goosebumps books published in the 90s. And they're all vintage copies of them because, one, I loved them as a kid, and I still like them now because of the entertainment value, and two, I like the old editions because of the wonderful cover art. that really made them stand out, done by the wonderful artist Tim Jacobus. Tim Jacobus is one of my favorite artists, and he's actually, shockingly, he's actually friends with me on Facebook. I'm shocked. He sent me a friend request because I had no idea he knew who I was. I'm some nobody, and he's a great artist. And yeah, we're friends. That's cool. So I mentioned all the books I have, or on most of the shelves. The half shelf I have is on a dresser over there. Top shelf is mostly the Harry Potter books, as well as other things like novels by Shirley Jackson, several Brian Evenson novels, and books of short stories. The second shelf is mostly Clive Barker. Almost all of the second shelf is Clive Barker novels and short stories. Third shelf, third and last shelf on the very bottom of this half bookshelf is an eclectic range of things. Everything from Leif Anger's novel Peace Like a River to William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, to a few novels by Paul Tremblay, to some short story collections by Laird Barron, as well as Barron's novel The Croning. I have a couple of novels by Stephen Graham Jones. I have a few novels by Neil Gaiman. I have a couple of books by Lisa Goldstein. I have on that shelf is also Dan Simmons' novel Hyperion, and I have a collection by Gemma Files called The Worm in Every Heart, which is an excellent book of short stories. And I also have Kelly Link's book of short stories, Magic for Beginners, which is also a great collection of short stories. And I also have a paperback copy of Robert Heinlein's novel, The Cat Who Walks Through Walls. And off of the shelf, but on that dresser in front of the shelf, I have Poppy Z. Bright's novel, Drawing Blood. I have R.L. Stein's novel for adults, Red Rain. I have Carson McCullers' novel, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, and a stack. And in the second stack in front of that bookshelf, I have John Stanford's Shadow Prey, All the Missing Girls by Megan something. It's so far away I can't read the spine. David Badolci novel, Frank Herbert's Dune, and on the very bottom of that stack, I have David Drake's novel, Seas of Venus. And that is everything book-wise on that dresser, on that shelf, on that dresser. And then I've listed pretty much everything I have on the next bookshelf. On top of the next bookshelf, I failed to mention I have some books stacked on top of the shelf, including Heart of the Country, which is a historical novel, The Toy Collector, which is a novel by James Gunn. And the stack next to that, I have the Big Book of Pulps, which is a collection of crime, pulpy short stories published in the vintage days. I have a collected edition of Earthsea novels by Ursula Le Guin, as well as her novel, The Left Hand of Darkness. And on top of those, I have 3 books by Osamu Dazai. And on top of that, I have the first volume of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan called The Eye of the World. And on top of that, I have Michael Chabon's novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And the last but not least book on top of that stack is House of Sand and Fog by Andre Dubois III. And that is everything on that shelf. So I've listed everything I have on my 3 bookshelves, as well as most of the stuff on the dresser opposite me here. That dresser. And I mentioned everything I have on this bookshelf. It's right in front of me. So that's most of what I got book-wise. Mostly. Other things, I have a few other things that I forgot to mention. Like, I have some books on self-publishing. I have the novel House of Leaves, which is also on the desk, as well as some other books. I got a bunch of nonfiction books about Joyce, specifically books on decoding Finnegan's Wake. and what the meanings of it are. I got a bunch of books on that topic, including Anthony Burgess's book Rejoice, which is a critical evaluation of Joyce's work. Speaking of Joyce, I also have 2 copies of Ulysses in addition to my copy of Finnegan's Wake. There are 2 paperback copies of different editions. I typically don't buy more than 1 copy, but if I like a novel enough and it has a second edition, I will buy another copy of it. For instance, I have a box set of the Dark Tower books in paperback, but I also have a vintage paperback copy of one of the books in the series, so it sits on top of the box set on the shelf in front of me. The one with all the poetry and Stephen King and Joyce Carol's. And so, yeah, that's most of what I got. And then beside me here on the bed, I have several library books. Among them are The Institute by King, The Curious Incident of the Dog at the Night Time by Mark Haddon, Alice Sebold's memoir called Lucky, and a few others. So yeah, that's most of what I got book-wise. That's most of the contents of my room. It's a tiny room, so I don't have a whole lot in here besides bookshelves, books, a desk, art supplies, my guitar, and a few cases of water. That's most of what I got in this bed. And that's about it. And I'm sure you're bored senseless listening to me talk about everything that I own. Sorry, I couldn't think of anything else to talk about. I hope you don't mind. But yeah, I guess I will end the video here because I've been talking forever. But I hope you're doing okay. And I miss you. So I will talk to you tomorrow. Bye.